breaking news this hour. President Putin's announced an Easter truce in Ukraine. A statement from the Kremlin said all Russian forces would cease hostilities from 3 p.m. GMT today, that's 4 p.m. BST, and that the pause would last until the end of Sunday. Now, at the moment, we don't have a response from Ukraine. Well, joining me in the studio is our World Affairs correspondent, Joe Inwood. So, Joe, of course, all of this is coming to us at the moment. Only in the last hour or so, we saw Vladimir Putin deliver that statement on Russian TV. First of all, let's break it all down. Just tell us exactly what we know about this so far.
So this was, as you can see from the conversation between President Putin and Valery Gerasimov, a senior military man. They're having one of these rather stage-managed conversations in which President Putin essentially delivers a statement. And what we know is that they've said they've declared a unilateral ceasefire for, as you say, for the Easter period. This, according to the statements we've seen, would start 6 o'clock local time and goes on until midnight tomorrow. So we're looking at as a fairly reasonable amount of time. And what they've said is there will be no fighting from the Russians in that period. But crucially, they've said that they are going to stand ready to repel any attacks that come from the Ukrainian side. And I think the context to this that matters is that for the Russians, they will be quite keen to show, I think, that the Ukrainians are not acting in good faith, have not stuck to the ceasefire. The reason that this is all important is because of the talks that have been going on. More importantly, the reaction that the Trump presidency have had to the possibility of peace. I mean, President Trump came into power saying he was going to get this fixed in 24 hours, get a ceasefire in 24 hours. That obviously didn't happen. And they've had another 100 days or so, and they've still struggled to get anything. And we've had these talks, and at the end of them, Secretary of State Marco Rubio came out and said they would walk away if both sides were acting in bad faith, or if either side was acting in bad faith. So I wouldn't be surprised at all if what we see is this ceasefire declared, and then accusations from the Russians that the Ukrainians have breached it, because that will give them ammunition to say, look, they're not acting in good faith, we are the ones trying to pursue a ceasefire.
No response as yet from the Ukrainians. I thought it was interesting when I looked at this statement from Vladimir Putin, or some of the comments that he was delivering alongside his military chief, that he said, based on humanitarian considerations, the Russian side's announced an Easter truce.
Yes, and I think that will be met with, should we say, some scepticism in Kyiv and in European capitals. I don't think many people could accuse the Russians of acting with humanitarian considerations in all of this. Of course, that has always been one of the reasons that Russia gave for starting this entire war was the humanitarian situation, specifically, they said, of Russian-speaking people in the Donbass, something which has never really been should we say, internationally agreed upon, that was their consideration. And I think few people will think now that they are acting for humanitarian reasons. Quite what they are thinking, we don't know, other than what they've said publicly. But yes, I think they'll be met with suspicion and, yes, disagreement in Kiev.
A question many of our viewers might be asking is, why just an Easter truce? I mean, is this a PR stunt by the Kremlin? Could this lead to a longer truce in the long run? I mean, of course, this is all conjecture at the moment, but what's your analysis of that?
There has been this talk of a ceasefire, and the Ukrainians came out straight away and said, yes, we will have an unconditional ceasefire. We will, we're happy stop the fighting. The key demand, of course, of President Trump, they say they want a ceasefire. But the Russians came out and said, if we're going to have any ceasefire, any longer-term ceasefire, we need to agree lots of other preconditions before. All of these various things that the Russians have always said, from their perspective, were the reason this entire situation has come about, whether that is that they always use the phrase denazification of Ukraine. What they actually mean is the removal of Vladimir Zelinsky. They don't like his democratically elected government. There's all sorts of other preconditions that they have always put on. And they basically said that for any ceasefire to come in, those needed to be met first. Whereas, of course, the Ukrainian position is, no, let's have a ceasefire, let's have a truce, and then then we can start working out exactly how we make it something, a full peace deal. The Russians say as well that their concern is that the Ukrainians would use any sort of ceasefire to rearm, to bolster their forces. Again, something that the Ukrainians would say of the Russians as well. I think it's also worth pointing out that we did have a discussion around, or an agreement indeed, that there would be a truce looking at stopping the attacks on energy infrastructure, and almost straight away that was breached. We've seen explosions taking place inside Ukrainian territory, and the Ukrainians are accused of the same thing by Russia. So I think any kind of agreement, getting anything to stick, is going to be very, very difficult. I guess having something which is 36 hours has got more chance. But I also think it's going to be very interesting to see whether both sides accuse each other of violating it.
And just one more thing that sort of comes into the broader conversation around this, because we know in terms of a longer-term ceasefire, there's been quite a few sticking points, and one of them has been a post-ceasefire peacekeeping force. And we've seen the UK leading on that, indeed, alongside EU leaders like Emmanuel Macron of France. We haven't had any reaction yet from any European leaders to this announcement. It's just broken, of course, in the last hour. But what do you think the calculations might be now from European leaders?
I mean, the Europeans will view this very, very sceptically. I mean, I think it's fair to say that there is not just lack of trust, there is no trust between the various sides in this conflict. And I think most people would say, other than possibly the top of the American administration now, all sides on the Ukraine side of the ledger say they don't trust the Russians to act in good faith at all. To come back to that peacekeeping force, the one that's being discussed, it was interesting listening to Sergei Markov, who's a Kremlin, a former member of the Duma and a Kremlin spokesperson, but seen as someone who speaks from the Kremlin's perspective. He was saying today that any European force, any NATO forces, would be viewed as a hostile and invading force rather than a peacekeeping force. He was calling for other nations not so closely aligned with Ukraine to be the ones that would lead any peacekeeping operations. So I think there we are really, should we say, it's going to be difficult for this coalition of the willing, as it's currently composed, and it is going to be the UK and France that would provide the manpower, would be the ones who would give it some backbone. Of course, not as much backbone as the Americans would, but we're not expecting them to put any boots on the ground. That force would be very, very, very difficult to get the Russians to accept that as a legitimate peacekeeping force.
Just to say, Vladimir Putin said that this latest truce, from Russia at least, will show, I quote, how sincere the Kyiv's regime's readiness, its desire and ability to observe agreements and participate in a process of peace talk. So, in a way, Vladimir Putin there saying, well, this is a test now, not on Russia, but on Kyiv. But it is interesting, as you touched on before, that there have been previous attempts around Easter when it comes to holding ceasefires, April 2022 and the Orthodox Christmas in January 2023. But they didn't come to fruition because both sides failed to agree. So is it possible that we could be talking in a couple of hours and saying, well, actually, this is only a one-sided ceasefire?
Well, it's interesting that the point that Vladimir Putin there makes there, in a way, backs up or agrees with the point I made at the start, that it is quite possible that the Russians will be using this. I mean, this is conjecture at this point, of course. This is only just broken, but it's quite possible the Russians would use this as an opportunity to try and make the case, and there's the audience that they're making this case to is the White House, that the Ukrainians are not partners in peace, as they would put it. Of course, now the Ukrainians would completely dispute that, but they might use this by saying, we declare a unilateral ceasefire. They can then, it gives them an opportunity to accuse the Ukrainians of breaching something, whether or not they do. Because that, if they can make the case to the Americans that the Ukrainians have not gone along with this ceasefire, well, that makes it more likely that the Americans will say, a pox in all your houses, and walk away from this. And in a way, if that happened, if the Russians were able to get the Americans to pull out of anything, any attempts at peace, well, that would be to Moscow's advantage and to Kyiv's very significant disadvantage.
OK, Joe Winwood.